CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Saudi Arabia and Iran agree to restore diplomatic ties after decades of tension in a deal brokered by Beijing.
Our other headline, Xi Jinping starts a new term as the leader of the world's second largest economy.
Shares in banks around the world slump after Silicon Valley Bank signals it's in trouble. We'll be live in New York.
The UK will help fund a migrant detention centre in France as part of a $500 million deal between French President Macron and UK Prime Minister Sunak.
Saudi Arabia and Iran have agreed to resume diplomatic ties in a deal brokered by Beijing. The agreement will see the Gulf's two biggest rivals reinstate relations, which have been bitter as far back as the Islamic Revolution of 1979. Saudi Arabia officially broke off ties with Tehran in 2016. The deal includes reopening their embassies within 2 months.
Mohammed Marandi is an Iranian-American academic and political analyst. Mohammed, welcome back to the show. Just for those of us who are not experts in this region, just tell us how significant this is.
It is important, especially since the region has been facing great difficulties and there's been a lot of suffering over the last few decades because of the different divisions. In particular, we had Saddam Hussein's war against Iran, which had Western support as well as Saudi support. We had the dirty war in Afghanistan, then 9/11, and then the U.S. occupation, and subsequently the occupation of Iraq. And then, of course, we also had the dirty war in Syria, where NATO countries and their regional allies supported ISIS and al-Qaeda to overthrow the Syrian government. So, and then, of course, the war in Yemen, where the people there have suffered under Saudi and Emirati attacks supported by the West. So you have all these conflicts. And of course, then there's the Israeli regime, its attacks on Lebanon and Syria and on the Palestinian people. So we have many different divisions, but there are some positive signs as well. Right now, we see gradually regional countries moving towards rapprochement with Syria and greater rapprochement between Turkey and Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. And if Iran and Saudi Arabia can move forward with rapprochement, then there's a greater opportunity to start rebuilding the region, especially after all of the hardships that people have been enduring. And the more the U.S. and its allies retreat from the region, the less influence they have on the region, the greater the opportunity there is for countries to come together, because the main reason for these divisions and the divide and the conflicts, the wars, dirty wars, and sanctions is, of course, the United States.
Mohammed, what was China's role and influence in brokering this deal now?
What happened was that during President Raisi's state visit to Beijing, the two presidents spoke about the region and how to decrease tensions in the region and to build confidence among countries in the region. And they decided to see if they could use Beijing as a suitable platform to create rapprochement or bring about rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. There were talks, a series of talks between officials from Iran and Saudi Arabia in Iraq and other places, but this was the highest level. The two sides had a very high-level delegation in Beijing. The head of the Iranian Supreme National Security Council was there, and the talks lasted for a number of days. And so these talks were more serious and more intense, and they ultimately bore fruit. So Beijing definitely had a significant role to play in this change.
After decades of tension, now this deal, what is the significance of the timing? Why now?
Well, the world is changing very fast. It's becoming more chaotic. It's becoming more dangerous. We have the war in Europe. We have tensions rising over Taiwan. And, of course, West Asia has always been a very volatile region for the last few decades. And, therefore, both countries see it as important to have better relations during these very difficult circumstances. The United States has also shown itself not to be a very reliable partner. We saw that in Afghanistan. We even see it now in Georgia, where a government that is close to the West is being attacked by the West because of a proposed law. So countries like Saudi Arabia look upon these acts of Western countries, of NATO countries, and they feel it to be necessary that they should find alternatives, and they should diversify their contacts and relations, and to decrease tension so that they are not vulnerable to the United States and to NATO. And of course, for the Iranians, it is the policy of the new president in Iran is to strengthen ties with neighboring countries and to create greater convergence among Asian and Eurasian states. So this is a part of the new President Raisi's policy.
Mohammed, we have to leave it there. Good to talk to you, and thanks for your time. Mohammed Marandi talking to us there from Tehran.
Silicon Valley Bank is reportedly in talks to sell itself after attempts to raise funds failed. Shares in the group are suspended after plunging 60% in Thursday's trade in the United States and falling even further in after-hours trade. Banking shares around the world have continued to see a sell-off in reaction to the crisis. Well, our correspondent Michael Voss has been following the story. Michael.
Robin, SVB, Silicon Valley Bank, is the key lender for technology startups. It's the banking partner for nearly half of US venture-backed technology and healthcare companies that listed on stock markets last year. The crisis hit when the bank announced a $2.25 billion stock sale to shore up its finances. It turns out that at the height of the tech boom, SVB had placed almost $100 billion in what were thought to be safe securities like mortgage bonds and US treasuries. Instead, it's lost about $15 billion. The result, shares in SVB plunged by more than 60% on Thursday. But the ripple effect is much wider because it's raising concerns about the health of the entire sector, sending banking shares tumbling around the world. Robin.
Michael, thank you very much. So let's take a closer look now at how the markets are reacting and talk to our correspondent, John Terrett, who's on Wall Street. So, John, SVB, not a bank that many of us may have heard of. How bad is this?
Well, you're right about that, Robin. You really are, and Jamie and Michael. You know, it is the 15th biggest lender in the United States. So in many ways, it's a banking minnow. It really isn't one of the giant banks that we have here on Wall Street. It's based in Santa Clara in California, which is interestingly where Intel, the giant chip maker, is based. And they do have an office on Park Avenue, in swanky Park Avenue here in Midtown Manhattan. But they also have about 20 other branches dotted around the country. And as Mike was saying there, they have a customer base that is really almost exclusively what we call venture capital startups. So, as Mike was saying, things like technology companies and healthcare companies in the Silicon Valley area go to them to raise money to start their businesses and to continue their businesses. Now, the problem with Silicon Valley Bank is that basically it shot itself in the foot. That's essentially what it did. It overlent to these customers in very, very uncertain times. And this is really a profit story at the end of the day. Now, they tried to cover it up, if you will, or I suppose a better way of putting it would be to try and put things right by introducing 2.4, I think it was 2.4, 2.2, something like that, million shares. But customers got wind of it and sort of said, well, what are you doing? And they said, well, it's all fine, don't worry, it's going to be okay. And the customer said, I think we'll just take our money out just in case. So there was basically a run on the bank. That's what's been going on. And as a result of that, the SVB share price fell very heavily yesterday. It was down 50 or 60%. This morning, before it was suspended, it was down another 50%. And then it was suspended. And the reason for that is we now learn that the bank is talking about selling itself. So they obviously think they've got a viable business, or the rump of a viable business that somebody might like to buy, and that's the route that they're going to go down. But I think they clearly need more money than they can raise on their own now in order for the business to continue. Robin and Jamie?
So, John, how serious could this be? Could it spread to other banks?
Well, let me explain that to you. I think there's potentially people think that there is a risk here, most certainly. And obviously we all remember 2008 and what turned into the global financial crisis and crash with the collapse of two big Wall Street banks. First of all, Bear Stearns, and then Lehman Brothers, and then things flowed from there. Now, as I've said, SVB is a much, much smaller bank than even they were. And most of its customers are venture capitalists. The Wall Street banks, on the other hand, the big names that you know and have heard of around the world, the JP Morgans and the Bank of Americas and the Wells Fargos and the Morgan Stanleys. These banks, generally speaking, they're more into investment banking and commercial banking and financial transactions, the clearing and processing of everything that happens here in the stock exchange, and also asset management as well. So in other words, their businesses are much more diverse, far more widespread, so therefore safer than the smaller bank that we're talking about. But the problem is, and the reason this contagion issue comes up, is because I'm afraid they're not the only bank that appears to be in trouble right now. Only yesterday, Silvergate, which was the bank of choice for cryptocurrency enthusiasts, went under. It turned out to be far too exposed to FTX, the now collapsed second biggest cryptocurrency exchange in the world, and whose boss, Sam Bankman-Fried, is being pursued to the nth degree by federal authorities in the New York courts for fraud. And then an even bigger worry, I'm afraid to say, appears to be Credit Suisse. Now, Credit Suisse, as you know, is the giant Swiss bank, and there have been rumors about what's going on there on and off for the past couple of months. And then, yesterday, Thursday, the leading regulator in the United States, the main powerful one, the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, asked Credit Suisse not to publish their annual report. And this is because they have concerns about previous similar reports. So this is potentially a big worry because Credit Suisse, of course, is a major financial institution. Now, we simply don't know what's going on there. It is Friday, and I think that's a good thing. And hopefully cooler heads will prevail over the weekend. But we'll have to see where we are come Monday. In the meantime, the Silvergate collapse has meant that Bitcoin is now back below 20,000. Robin and Jamie?
And, John, we've had those February job numbers you told us to look out for yesterday, and they're better than some had expected.
Yes, it rather depends on your point of view there, actually. I mean, it turns out that in February, 311,000 new jobs were created, not 255,000. The number for January and December was revised downwards by 34,000. The unemployment rate went up to 3.6%. The average hourly earnings up a little bit to 4.6% for the year, 0.2% in this basic forecast. The problem with it, it basically was hotter than expected, and now the markets are selling off because they think there will be a 50 basis point interest rate hike next Wednesday when the Federal Reserve next meets. We have a CPI piece of data to come in before then. That's crucial inflation data, so we'll see. But I will leave you with this thought ahead of the weekend, that if the Fed only raises by 25 basis points on Wednesday, then the markets will say you haven't done enough and they'll sell off. And if they raise by 50 basis points, they'll go, oh my gosh, a recession is on the way, and they'll sell off anyway. So these are the times we live in.
John, thank you very much. Our correspondent John Terrett on Wall Street.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, trade tension between the EU and the United States. Ursula von der Leyen heads to Washington for talks with President Biden.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? and unicorn companies. Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
There's a new agenda for a new world, accelerating change in almost every part of our lives. It's shifting the norms of how we work, travel, and connect. How we think, interact, and develop. It's a new reality, a new agenda with me, Juliet Mann.
This week on Razor, building highways for bees and finding out how life moved from water to land.
Those genes that are responsible for this adaptation were brought into this organism by a DNA virus. Now the question is, where did the viruses get the bacterial genes from?
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe.
The UK will help fund a migrant detention centre in France. That's part of $570 million in new funding agreed by UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and French President Emmanuel Macron at their first summit in 5 years. The two leaders held talks to try and iron out differences over migration and deepen ties after years of post-Brexit disputes.
Emmanuel and I share the same belief. Criminal gangs should not get to decide who comes to our countries. Within weeks of my coming into office, we agreed our largest ever small boats deal. And today we've taken our cooperation to an unprecedented level to tackle this shared challenge. We're announcing a new detention centre in northern France, a new command centre bringing our enforcement teams together in one place for the first time, and an extra 500 new officers patrolling French beaches.
Well, let's talk to our correspondent, Ross Cullen, who's in Paris. So, Ross, migration, a big part of today's agenda.
Yeah, hi, Robin. It really was a big part of today's agenda, one of the top items for the discussions by Rishi Sunak and Emmanuel Macron in the Élysée Palace. You can see the French presidential office and residence behind me. They wanted to discuss the UK's proposed legislation. I'm sure there was some interpretation of that by Rishi Sunak for Emmanuel Macron, explaining the new proposed bill focusing on illegal immigration in the UK. Rishi Sunak was saying that that is actually a legislation which will benefit both sides of the channel, with that new nearly $600 million cash injection by London to Paris to fund France building a new detention centre here. Also an increased number of police officers patrolling the beaches of northern France from where the boats headed for the United Kingdom leave. Also increased surveillance, the use of drones. Emmanuel Macron saying that this is a reinforcing of new initiatives, a reinforcing of our fight against illegal immigration, and also hailing the new funding initiatives. Of course, he was referencing the funding cash from London to Paris to help France build that detention centre.
And Ross, this summit also a chance for a reset to the Britain-France relationship after what's been a tough few years.
Yeah, really tough few years since the Brexit vote in 2016, then the AUKUS crisis in 2021 when Australia abruptly cancelled a submarine deal with France, going behind France's back, according to the French Foreign Ministry, to sign a new deal instead with the UK and with the US, and there'll be a summit next week of those three countries focusing on that submarine deal. But France and the UK have managed to overcome those difficulties, and Emmanuel Macron, the French president, the host of this summit here on Friday, was hailing that new relationship.
Today, this summit is indeed exceptional. It's a moment, clearly, I would say, of reunion, of reconnection, and of a new beginning. it marks a shared will to speak to one another, to better coordinate and build together new prospects in this context. And I believe that the will that you clearly expressed and that we discussed jointly together, and what our governments have worked on, what we managed to create.
It's hard to overstate just how bad the relationship had got, Robin, between Britain and France, but it's also important to underline today the brotherly embraces, the real feeling of warmth. There was a real change in tone now between the leadership in the United Kingdom and France. You might remember in 2022, the former British Prime Minister Liz Truss said, when she was asked if Emmanuel Macron was a friend or foe, she said the jury's out. Well, today, the current British Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, looked to Emmanuel Macron during their closing news conference and said, "I am fortunate to be working and serving alongside you, and I am incredibly excited about the future."
Ross, thank you very much. Our correspondent Ross Cullen in Paris.
The UK economy expanded by 0.3% month-on-month in January as output in growth surpassed the forecast. The boost is likely to tame recession fears ahead of Finance Minister, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Jeremy Hunt's spring budget announcement next week. Gross domestic product dropped by 0.5% in December.
Shares have fallen in JD.com after China's second biggest online retailer announced a sharp drop in revenue growth. Takings were up by 7% from October to December, but that's a fraction of what they were during the same period in 2021. There have been signs of a rebound in consumer spending in recent weeks, but JD warned that a full recovery will take time.
New bank lending in China reached $260 billion in February, falling less than expected after coming off a record high in January. Analysts had predicted new loans would drop to $220 billion. China reported strong credit growth and demand for February as Beijing looks to boost economic recovery after lifting coronavirus restrictions in December.
US carmaker Ford has announced it's cutting around 1,100 jobs from its factory in Spain as the company reorganises its operations in Europe. The cuts at the plant in Valencia follow the loss of nearly 4,000 jobs, mostly coming from the UK and Germany.
US President Joe Biden is set to welcome the European Union's top official to the White House in the coming hours. Ursula von der Leyen is in Washington, hoping to ease a rather tense dispute over subsidies between the two giant trading blocs. Let's talk to our correspondent, Benji Hire, watching events for us. Benji, the EU is rather frustrated at one of President Biden's signature economic packages. What more can you tell us?
Yeah, the thing is, Jamie, that the European leaders are anxious, I think, over some of the details in Mr. Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, specifically in relation to clean energy. The fact that I should say that tax credits have been offered to vehicle manufacturers, electric vehicle manufacturers, but only those based in the United States. And that's the key thing here. Now, Mr. Biden says that he has spoken to his European friends, the heads of state. He claims that he's not trying to deny them anything. But European leaders are still concerned that those incentives in that deal could push some manufacturers from Europe stateside. We've already heard an announcement from the German manufacturer Volkswagen that it's putting on pause construction of a battery plant in Eastern Europe after it discovered it could make tens of billions of dollars of savings by moving that plant to the United States. Despite those tensions, the expectation is that this meeting will be convivial. There is hope, certainly, that a deal can be reached to ensure that European firms can still benefit from some of those subsidies that are only available currently to American producers. And Ms. von der Leyen will be looking for some commitments from the White House that she can use as reassurance back home when addressing European leaders.
Benji, let's put the subsidies row to one side for a moment. What else is going on? What else is on the agenda or expected to come out of these two meetings?
I think, unsurprisingly, both of them will want to talk about Ukraine and to reaffirm their commitment to supporting Ukraine. The White House put out a statement shortly, this morning, I should say, which says it defends the sovereignty and democracy for Ukraine. But ultimately, I think that with the attitudes in Europe potentially changing on this matter, certainly some reluctance in Germany about continuing financial and military assistance, and also economic constraints here in the US for Joe Biden, with Republican lawmakers in Congress uneasy about writing a blank check for Ukraine, it's going to be harder as the months go on for that cooperation to be as strong as it was at the beginning of that conflict. Also, the White House statement saying that Ms von der Leyen and Mr Biden will discuss other international security challenges, including those relating to China. Nothing specific in that statement. We might hear more afterwards, but I think the US will want to try to align the EU closer towards its hawkish stance on Beijing, especially amid those allegations from Washington, D.C. that China wants to do more to support Moscow, accusations, though, that China has denied.
Benji, thanks for that. Our correspondent, Benji Hire, in the United States.
And you can get highlights from the week's news in Europe and China direct to your inbox from CGTN's Storyboard email newsletter. You can sign up at europe.cgtn.com/newsletter.
Europe.cgtn.com has all the week's top stories from China. Here's a quick take of some of them.
International Women's Day was enjoyed throughout China with a variety of events marking the annual celebration. China and Spain are celebrating 50 years of diplomatic relations. A freight train left Yiwu for Madrid to mark the ties. The biggest annual event on China's political calendar got underway in Beijing, promoting high-quality development. Thanks to fertilizer application drones and a navigation system, agricultural machinery can operate automatically with a precision of 2 centimeters. China has revealed plans to launch a new interplanetary mission called Tianwen-2 to target a small near-Earth asteroid. East China's Shandong province welcomed the world's first delivery of an integrated construction liquefied natural gas modular plant.
All that and more at cgtn.com.
Still ahead, silver tsunami and not enough babies. Elderly populations are soaring as birth rates plummet.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference. Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities, reinvent, find new opportunities, discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
What do we mean when we talk about the difference?
Brazen axe.
The difference is in the detail, in the background,
Defense ministers from
the wider angle and perspective of every story. Wherever the story may be. CGTN. See the difference.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Saudi Arabia and Iran agreed to restore diplomatic ties after decades of tension in a deal brokered by Beijing.
Xi Jinping starts a new term as the leader of the world's second-largest economy.
And shares in banks around the world slump after Silicon Valley Bank signals it's in trouble.
Xi Jinping starts a new term as the leader of the world's second-largest economy.
A number of other senior leaders are also being selected during the country's annual political gatherings, which are taking place in Beijing.
Our correspondent Zhou Jiaxin reports.
By a unanimous vote, Xi Jinping is elected Chinese president and chairman of the Central Military Commission after a standing ovation at the Great Hall of the People. The president walks to the podium, taking an oath of allegiance to the Constitution.
I pledge to be allegiant to the Constitution of the PRC, safeguard the Constitution's authority, fulfill my legal obligations, be loyal to the country and the people, be committed and honest in my duty, accept the people's supervision, and work for a great modern socialist country that is prosperous, strong, democratic, culturally advanced, harmonious and beautiful.
During last October's CPC National Congress, she was elected General Secretary of the party's 20th Central Committee. At that time, she said China, having completed its building of a moderately prosperous society in all respects, is now taking confident strides on a new journey to turn China into a modern socialist country in all respects. In the past decade, the world's second-largest economy has eradicated absolute poverty and built the largest education, social security, and healthcare systems in the world. She said China has also joined the ranks of the world's innovators while achieving an overwhelming victory in fully consolidating the gains in the fight against corruption. During this year's 2 sessions, she has met with lawmakers from the Chinese military and armed police force, calling for opening new ground for enhancing integrated national strategies and strengthening strategic capabilities. In 2027, the People's Liberation Army is due to achieve its sanitary goal of becoming a world-class force and further modernize the military. Lawmakers at the 3rd plenary session elected Zhao Leji as chairman of the 14th NPC Standing Committee and Han Zheng as vice president of China. They also adopted the plan for the second round in a decade of institutional restructuring of the State Council. Under President Xi, China will continue the process of modernization at home while communicating China's proposition to the world. As the president said in his New Year address, that the country is working hard to contribute Chinese wisdom and solutions to the cause of the peace and development for all humanity. Zhou Jiaxin, CGTN at the Great Hall of the People in Beijing.
Our correspondent Feng Yilei has been watching the developments from the political meetings in Beijing.
Today's agenda also included election of a new leadership for the 14th CPPCC National Committee, and Wang Huning was elected as the chairman of China's top political advisory body. And besides, a total of 23 people were elected vice chairperson, and Wang Dongfeng was elected as secretary general. And apart from the election, a plan to reorganize institutions under the State Council was also approved by the NPC today, and that reform has made an emphasis on various key areas in China's modernization process, including, for example, rural revitalization, intellectual property rights, and elderly care. And let's take the revamp of the Ministry of Science and Technology as an example. So its functions after restructuring will be streamlined and more centralized. And a deputy who specialized in sci-tech field told me earlier that the restructuring of the Ministry of Science and Technology is essential for China to make breakthroughs and achieve self-reliance in core technologies, especially those that are exclusive to foreign countries at the present. And for financial regulations, experts say that reform seek to better handle the relationship between the government and the market, and one of the key points here is to prevent economic policies and regulations from infringing on the interests of businesses. And tomorrow, the fourth plenary meeting of the session will appoint the premier of the State Council and the vice chairpersons, as well as members of the Central Military Commission. And deputies will also elect the director of the National Supervisory Commission and president of the Supreme People's Court and the Procurator General of the Supreme People's Procuratorate. And on the day after tomorrow, other leaders, including vice premiers, state councillors, ministers, and secretary general of the State Council will be appointed.
China's elderly population is soaring as its birth rate plummets. Last year, China recorded its first population decline in 6 decades. What to do about it is being debated at the 2 sessions. It's part of a global trend dubbed the Silver Tsunami. Let's take a look at this in a bit more detail. First, China's demographics. Well, the number of people born this year will be far smaller than the number of people in their 60s, and it's a trend set to continue. Here in Europe, Italy's population is aging and shrinking at the fastest rate in the West. Of course, Italy is much smaller than China, and these population numbers are in the thousands, not the millions. But you can see the shape of the graphics is pretty much the same. Africa's most populous country, Nigeria, has the absolute opposite. Let's take a look at this. You can see the contrast is pretty stark, isn't it? We'll be taking a closer look at what European governments are doing about this in a moment. First, back to China and what social policies are being proposed there. James Liang is a demographer and the author of a book on population trends. He says China is facing a major demographic challenge.
Like many other countries, China can do cash subsidy, tax incentives, housing incentives, and direct, financial support of all these measures to support families. And on top of that, China can do to help particular family, particular woman to balance the career and childbearing is, building a lot of daycare centers like some of the European countries that do. And also, lastly, very importantly, education reform. Try to reduce the kind of arms race to getting to the elite colleges.
So what further policies should be put in place to try to address this challenge of a shrinking and an aging population?
The solution, there's ways to mitigate the aging problem by, for example, raising retirement age, to have higher tax rates for the young, but the ultimate solution is to have financial support and also other kinds of policy support for family to raise children, to reduce their burden financially and time pressure to raise children, just like other countries have done.
And how will China cope with that shrinking workforce?
The last few years, the last 5 years, as I said, is where we see a very steep decline of fertility rate. And it takes, 20 years for kids to grow up. And China really has to deal with this, 20 years later. But the solution for this is to act now, to have procreation policies right now to increase the fertility rate. Otherwise, 20 years from now, they're really in a very difficult situation. Either you have very high burden tax rate, or you have to continuously raise the retirement age. And also your whole economy, the vitality and the creativity and the innovativeness of your economy is going to suffer too.
Well, in Italy, almost a quarter of the population is aged 65 or over, which has had a dramatic impact on the country's way of life. Our correspondent Giles Gibson reports from a small Italian town where children used to play in the streets, but now it's very different.
Life moves at a slow pace in Calcutta, a town perched on a cliff about an hour's drive from Rome. Other than some birds and a few cats, Alessandro Falconi is one of the few up and about this morning. He first moved to Calcutta in the early 1970s as a child, lived in Rome for a while and then came back.
When I came to live here again in 1994, there were still many families, whereas now there are fewer, and the number of old people has gone up, as well as people on their own.
And where do his two adult daughters live?
Roma.
In Rome, of course. Down a maze of small alleys is La Sala tea shop, run by another long-time resident. Gemma Utendala says she blames the changes in society on the cost of living.
It affects the growth of the country a lot. Even the current economic situation, it prevents people from having 2 or 3 children. In the old days, people were doing much better financially.
And for the very few young people left in Calcutta, it's hard to find work.
In terms of average age, this is one of the oldest provinces in this region. But that shift in demographics that's so clear to see when you're walking around this small town is also playing out across the entire country.
Ageing populations create an economic imbalance. More older people claiming pensions and other state benefits, and not enough younger people paying taxes to fund them. To show how seriously it's taking this problem, the Italian government has appointed a minister for families, the birth rate and equal opportunities. However, Italy's National Institute of Statistics says the situation is set to get worse.
This imbalance can be measured by comparing the number of people over 65 years old and the younger population. Between now and 2050, we expect that this number will grow to 297 people over 65 years old per 100 people under 15.
Back in Calcutta, there are signs everywhere of previous generations and hundreds of years of history. And it could take generations for Italy to turn its ageing population problem around. Giles Gibson for CGTN, Calcutta, Italy.
Well, Hungary's government is using baby loans and tax breaks to try and persuade more young women to have children. But is it working? Our correspondent Pablo Gutierrez reports now from Budapest.
Bedtime stories at the Szabo family home. This bedtime story is about a cat that went fishing with a fox. The Szabos love their new house. They finished building it a couple of years ago with the help of funding from the government after the birth of their third child.
If we hadn't been eligible, right now I can't possibly think of any other financial sources from which we could have financed basically the place you're looking at now.
The Szabos initially received a $50,000 loan as part of a program launched by the Hungarian government in 2019 aimed at boosting fertility rates. Under the scheme, half of the loan was written off after their third child was born, and the rest can be paid back within 20 years. Hungary is home to just over 9.5 million people, but statistics show its birth rate has been declining since the 1980s, and the population could shrink by as much as 1.5 million by the year 2050.
The demographic situation is deteriorating. Since the last census, Hungary has lost 300,000 inhabitants, which is huge compared to our size.
The government is trying to curb the decline with so-called baby loans, tax breaks for families with 3 or more children, but experts say that so far these are having little impact.
We are losing young people because they migrate to higher wage countries. And exactly that age group that counts in this particular aspect.
It's not just emigration that is reducing Hungary's population. Life expectancy is 5 years lower than the European Union average of 80 years. State-sponsored IVF clinics like this one are one part of the Hungarian government plan to boost fertility rates. But for now, more Hungarians die each year than are born. Nothing has yet to reverse that trend. Sol Magyari and Sandra Kochsis have chosen to only have one child. They say their experience of pregnancy and childbirth was traumatic and will only consider having another child if Hungarian healthcare, and particularly maternity care, improves.
I was sent home after the birth.
Yeah, that's also so cruel.
I couldn't stay with her, I couldn't stay here, and we were all separated because the kid was taken away into a room, she was alone, and I was alone.
Because it was perchance by night that he was born. We were told that we should sleep and have a rest. But after giving birth, I mean, maybe someone can sleep, but...
The Hungarian government has defended its policies, saying that boosting the birth rate is not a quick fix and will take a decade. Critics say that instead of loans and tax cuts, more should be spent on fixing healthcare and education, with an emphasis on quality over quantity. In Budapest, Pablo Gutierrez, CGTN.
In the space of a few decades, millions of people have moved from the country to cities like Shanghai. Juliet Mann has been looking at urbanization in China.
Yan Song, the director of North Carolina University's program on Chinese cities, explains how this massive migration has helped the economy flourish.
China's GDP per capita has increased, I think, more than tenfold since the 1980s, with much of its growth driven by urbanization. Cities such as Shenzhen has become the major economic hubs, attracting investment, creating a lot of jobs, and becoming sort of a major economic hub in the world. And also, another benefit is to increase productivity for the country. As more people move to cities, as you can see, there are a lot of concentration of great skills and entrepreneurs, and this could lead to a development of new industries and technologies.
And you can see more of that interview in the agenda with Juliet Mann this weekend here on CGTN.
You're watching CGTN, still ahead.
I have spent 12 years of my life in China. I had the incredible privilege of being 3 times ambassador of Spain in China.
We'll meet Eugenio Bregolat and discover how China has changed through his eyes.
Roger, making loud and clear.
We can try out the wild and crazy ideas.
Nothing can stop an idea whose time is coming. This idea is coming.
I actually feel quite comfortable in isolation.
We should all be very basic when we're trying to save the world.
Oh, no.
We hope it will happen. We have to live in hope.
Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities. Reinvent. Find new opportunities. Discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. Russia says it's watching events in Georgia with concern and claimed that the United States is behind the recent protests. The comments came after 3 nights of demonstrations against a bill which would have required organizations receiving overseas funding to register as foreign agents. Protesters accused the government of imposing Russian-style laws. A Kremlin spokesman also warned of what it called the risks of provocations in 2 Russian-backed breakaway regions of Georgia.
A gunman in Germany has shot dead 7 people, including an unborn baby, before killing himself. 8 other people are said to have been injured in a shooting at a Jehovah's Witness church in the city of Hamburg. Some are reported to be in a critical condition. Police say they're investigating the gunman's motive.
Turkey's President Erdogan has set a date for elections. They'll be held on the 14th of May, a month earlier than planned, despite the recent earthquakes. The vote is expected to be a big test for Erdogan, seeking to extend his 20 years in power. Turkey is grappling with a troubled economy, soaring inflation, and the aftermath of the earthquakes which killed tens of thousands of people and left millions homeless.
5 people have been handed over to authorities by a Mexican drug gang after the abduction of 4 Americans, 2 of whom were killed. A faction known as the Scorpions also issued an apology to the family of a Mexican woman who also died. In a letter, the group said the 5 gang members had acted without authority and discipline. The US citizens were captured a week ago. 2 were found alive on Monday.
Snow and freezing temperatures across the UK have disrupted transport, with rail, air travel and roads all affected. Hundreds of schools have been forced to close. People have been warned to take extra precautions and try to avoid unnecessary travel.
Now, few people have the opportunity to be envoy to one country twice, let alone 3 times.
In today's Bridge Builder series, we meet Eugenio Bregolat, who jokingly said he should apply for the Guinness World Record for having worked as Spain's ambassador to China on 3 separate occasions.
He told us how China has changed through the years.
My name is Eugenio Bregolat. I was born in this city of La Seu 80 years ago, and I have spent 12 years of my life in China. I had the incredible privilege of being 3 times ambassador of Spain in China. But in fact, no, not 3 times ambassador in the same country, because China, in these 3 different occasions, they were 3 different countries. So enormous, so incredible was the change in China along these decades. My favorite city in China is Beijing. I love the old Beijing, so close to the depths of Chinese culture. I would take my bicycle and suddenly I would go all the way by the Workers' Stadium down to Chang'an. Then from there, all the way to Tiananmen. From Tiananmen, I would go under the Arc of the Forbidden City, where Mao's portrait stands, to the gate of the Forbidden City, then turning left, and then moving through a very, very old hutong, a narrow street which was no more than 2 meters wide. You would go to the back door of the Forbidden City that is next to the Coal Hill. From there, you would follow to the Bell Tower. This today is impossible because of the cars, of course. But at the time, this was so nice, so rewarding. One of the things about living in China or Indonesia or these faraway places is that you realize that inevitably our culture is Eurocentric. We tend to look at the world through our own glasses and our own eyes because we only have our own eyes. Inevitably, we get into prejudices, we misunderstand many things. After living for a number of years in these distant countries, you realize that they have a different approach about life, about politics, about society. China, as everybody knows, is as ancient and more ancient than Rome. And it is like if Rome still existed today. To go to their house and to tell them how they should behave is a bit rash. Chinese sometimes talk about participatory democracy. For instance, the 5-year plan. One 5-year plan ends and they start already working in the next 5-year plan. They ask universities, think tanks, cities, provinces, government departments, party departments. With all that, they make a sort of first draft, circulate the first draft. Everybody makes observations, then they elaborate the second draft, and they try to consensuate to a large extent, and this is not well known or not at all known in the West. The Communist Party, to a large extent, is a consensus factory. I think that the last word about democracy in China has not been said. There they say, democracy is the best political system in the world. But there is not only the Western interpretation of democracy, there are other possible interpretations. We consider that our history, our political culture, our degree of economic and social development, all this has to be taken into account about the way we move towards democracy, which again, our interpretation of democracy itself and the goal itself is not the same that you do. And with the Chinese, we claim the right to decide when and how. We have to see Spain as a part of Europe, and then our political and geopolitical ideas about China are European ideas. They helped us very much. These are not only words, they helped us very much in the economic crisis starting in 2008. Chinese have been buying for many years Spanish debt in all the auctions, and they are the main owner of Spanish debt abroad. In the last few years, of course, with increase of diplomatic relations, more people traveling around. In the year before the virus, we had something like 900,000 Chinese in Spain. We can strengthen our cooperation in all fields. In the economic field, we are selling more, but we are buying much more. So economically, trade-wise, investment-wise, we can do much more. I think that we have to try, politically speaking, Spain and Europe, to keep close links to China. That's what Europe hopes, and I believe that this is the right way. It's necessary to keep doors and windows open. If we do not build bridges, we fall into the water. I would not change my life for anything. I am extremely happy of having had an opportunity to see the world changing before my eyes in China, and to my country for having allowed me to go 3 times to China so that I could see how things were so incredibly changing. So yes, I think that professionally speaking, I have been extremely lucky.
And for more of our Bridge Builder stories, you can go to CGTN Europe's digital platforms.
The headlines again. Saudi Arabia and Iran agreed to restore diplomatic ties after decades of tension in a deal brokered by Beijing.
Xi Jinping starts a new term as the leader of the world's second-largest economy.
And Silicon Valley Bank has failed, and the United States government regulator has now appointed an administrator. Bank stocks around the world have fallen as fears of contagion shake investors.
That's it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching.
More on all of our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're on smart TV apps, Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again on Monday, same time, same place. From all of the team in London, it's goodbye.
Goodbye.